All right, ready to get into it. We're diving into Goffman's Asylums today.
A classic,
Yeah.
a real eye-opener. It's amazing how relevant it still feels even after all these years.
Right. It's like he cracked the code of these institutions, not just mental hospitals, but prisons, boarding schools, any place where people are cut off from the outside world and kind of stripped of their individuality.
Exactly. And that's Goffman's real genius. I think he shows how these institutions, even though they seem so different on the surface, all rely on the same basic mechanisms of control.
Okay, so we're not going to do the whole explaining Goffman 101 thing. We're assuming you've at least skimmed Asylums. But I want to start with this idea of the mortification of the self. It's such a powerful phrase. It really gets at the heart of what Goffman's arguing.
Totally. He's talking about this systematic process of breaking down a person's identity, stripping them of everything that makes them unique.
And he doesn't shy away from the brutal details, does he? Like those examples of inmates being forced to wear uniforms, given numbers instead of names, having all their personal possessions taken away.
It's like the institution is trying to erase any trace of who they were before.
And then there's this idea of contamination of self, which is just as disturbing, if not more so.
Oh, yeah, that's where it gets really insidious. It's about blurring the lines between public and private, taking away any sense of personal space or privacy.
Right, like family visits happening out in the open with guards listening in or having to use the bathroom with no sense of privacy.
Exactly. And Goffman gives those really stark examples, like the practice of nuns publicly confessing their sins in exchange for food,
Begging soup, it's called. It's just, it's hard to even imagine.
or those public floggings they used to do on naval ships. It's all about humiliation, breaking down any sense of dignity or self-worth.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting because within these systems of control, these total institutions, Goffman also observes this other dynamic emerging, the privilege system.
Right. It's like this twisted game where the inmates are forced to participate in their own oppression.
So you're being controlled, but you're also being offered these tiny rewards for good behavior, like slightly better food, a few extra minutes of free time.
Exactly. And suddenly you're caught in the system where you're constantly striving for these tiny scraps of freedom, even as you're being stripped of your basic rights.
And this is where Goffman's concept of the underlife comes in, right?
Hmm.
That even within these incredibly oppressive environments, people find ways to carve out some sense of agency.
Absolutely. It's this whole hidden world that exists beneath the surface of the institution's rules and regulations.
And he gives us incredible examples like inmates figuring out how to escape surveillance, setting up secret communication networks, creating these elaborate systems of barter and exchange.
It's like they're building a whole parallel society with its own rules and rituals and codes of conduct. It's this whole hidden world operating beneath the surface of the institution's official rules and routines.
And Goffman doesn't just describe it, he celebrates it, right? He sees this underlife as proof of the human spirit's incredible ability to adapt and resist even in the most oppressive environments.
Absolutely. He doesn't see inmates as passive victims. He recognizes their agency, their ingenuity, their determination to hold on to some shred of their former selves.
And this is where his critique of the medical model comes in, right? Because he's not just interested in how institutions control people, he's also questioning the very assumptions behind how we treat mental illness.
Exactly. He argues that the traditional medical model, with its clear distinction between doctor and patient, breaks down when the possession being treated is the self.
Because you're not just fixing a broken bone here, you're dealing with someone's entire identity, their sense of reality.
And Goffman argues that this creates all sorts of ethical dilemmas for mental health professionals. How do you treat someone without further stripping away their sense of self? How do you navigate the power dynamics inherent in the doctor-patient relationship when the patient's very being is at stake?
It's a minefield. And Goffman doesn't offer any easy answers, but he forces us to confront these uncomfortable questions.
He's really pushing us to think beyond the traditional diagnoses and treatments and to consider the broader social and cultural factors that contribute to mental illness.
And that leads us to one of his most powerful concepts, the moral career of the mental patient.
Right, because Goffman recognizes that becoming a mental patient isn't just a medical event. It's a social process, a journey with distinct stages and challenges.
And it starts even before the person sets foot in a hospital, right? Goffman talks about the experience of the pre-patient, the gradual realization that something is wrong, the growing sense of isolation and stigma.
And he highlights how this process of being labeled mentally ill can become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Because people start treating you differently. They question your judgment, your sanity.
Exactly. And the pre-patient starts to internalize these doubts. Their sense of self begins to erode.
And Goffman points out that even well-meaning friends and family can contribute to this process.
They might try to rationalize the pre-patient's behavior, offer unsolicited advice, or even pressure them to seek help, often without really understanding what they're going through.
It's a delicate balance, right? Because on one hand, you need support, but on the other hand, you don't want to feel like you're being defined by your illness.
Precisely. And Goffman's analysis of the pre-patient's experience sheds light on the challenges of navigating this liminal space, caught between the world of the sane and the world of the mentally ill.
And then, of course, comes the moment of institutionalization.
The transition from pre-patient to patient, marked by that often traumatic entry into the total institution.
And the moral career takes a sharp turn at this point.
The individual is now officially under the control of the institution, subject to its rules, routines, and power dynamics.
Goffman describes the ward system as a kind of social ladder where patients are constantly being evaluated and either promoted or demoted based on their behavior.
It's this constant performance where you're trying to prove that you're getting better or at least not getting worse.
And the case record becomes this incredibly powerful document, right? It's the official narrative of your illness, shaping how staff perceive you and what privileges you're granted.
Goffman's analysis of the case record is fascinating. He shows how it can be used to control and justify treatment decisions, often with little input from the patient themselves.
It's like their voice gets lost in the bureaucracy of the institution.
Exactly. And this is where Goffman's work really starts to challenge the medical model's claim to objectivity.
Because he shows how even in seemingly neutral practices like record keeping, there's this inherent power dynamic at play.
And it's not just about patients. Goffman also explores the experiences of staff, showing how they too are shaped by the institutional context.
He talks about the moral division of labor within the hospital, where different staff levels have different roles, responsibilities, and even moral attributes assigned to them.
For example, attendants are often tasked with the day-to-day management of patients, enforcing rules, and doling out punishments or rewards.
Which puts them in a difficult position, right? Because they're expected to maintain order and control, but they also have to build relationships with patients.
And Goffman doesn't shy away from the darker side of this dynamic. He describes how staff can become cynical, detached, or even abusive, especially when faced with the challenges of managing a large and often resistant population.
It's like the institutional context itself can wear down even the most well-intentioned individuals.
Right. And Goffman shows how these pressures can lead to a dehumanization of both patients and staff, turning them into cogs in the machine.
But even within this bleak picture, Goffman finds moments of humanity, empathy, and connection.
He highlights the importance of individual relationships, both between patients and staff, as a way of resisting the dehumanizing effects of the institution.
He talks about the underlife, flourishing even here, with patients finding ways to create their own meaning, resist control, and build a sense of community.
He shares these incredible stories of ingenuity and resourcefulness patients, creating hidden stashes for personal belongings, finding ways to communicate secretly, even engaging in small acts of rebellion or humor to assert their individuality.
It's a reminder that even in the most controlled environments, the human spirit finds a way to adapt, resist, and even thrive.
And it's not just about individual survival, it's about collective resistance. Goffman talks about how patients can form alliances, create their own social hierarchies, and challenge the authority of the institution, however subtly.
He describes how these acts of resistance, however small, can be a powerful source of empowerment and solidarity for patients. They're a way of reclaiming their agency and asserting their humanity in the face of institutional control.
It's fascinating how Goffman flips the script. He doesn't just see patients as passive victims of the institution. He recognizes their strength, resilience, and their capacity for creative adaptation.
And that's a crucial insight for us as we think about the role of institutions in our own lives. It's a reminder that even within these seemingly rigid structures, individuals have the power to shape their own experiences and make their own choices.
Goffman also challenges us to think critically about the medical model itself. He's not saying it's inherently bad, but he questions its limitations when applied to mental illness.
Because, as we've discussed, the traditional doctor-patient relationship based on the assumption that the doctor is the expert and the patient is the passive recipient of treatment, can be problematic when the possession being treated is the self.
It's like trying to fix a broken bone when the fracture is in your very identity. And Goffman argues that this can create all sorts of ethical dilemmas for mental health professionals.
He's not providing easy answers, but he's raising important questions about the nature of mental illness, the role of institutions, and the power dynamics inherent in the medical model.
He's encouraging us to think beyond the traditional diagnoses and treatment approaches and to consider the broader social and cultural factors that contribute to mental health and well-being.
And he's reminding us that the experience of mental illness is not just a medical problem, it's also a human experience, shaped by individual stories, social contexts, and institutional structures.
It really is.
Yeah.
And one thing that we haven't touched on yet is this idea of institutional ceremony.
Oh, right. Because even in these incredibly controlled environments, Goffman noticed there are these moments of ritual and even celebration.
Exactly. And it seems kind of counterintuitive, right? Like, why would you have a Christmas party in a mental hospital?
Or a theatrical production. It's like, what's the point?
Well, Goffman argues that these ceremonies serve a lot of different purposes. For the institution, they're a way of presenting a positive image to the outside world.
It's like a PR stunt,
Yeah.
basically. Look, everything's fine here. The patients are happy. The staff are caring.
Exactly. But Goffman also sees a more subversive side to these ceremonies. He suggests that they can be a way for patients to kind of reclaim some of their individuality, to resist control.
Interesting. So how does that work?
Well, he talks about how patients might use humor or satire during these events to poke fun at the institution or the staff.
Kind of like a pressure valve.
Exactly. And Goffman observes how these little acts of rebellion, even if they're just jokes, can be really powerful for patients.
It's a way of saying, hey, I'm still here. I'm still a person.
Exactly. And that even though I'm stuck in this place, I haven't completely given up my sense of self.
It's a really interesting perspective.
And it's a good reminder that even in the most oppressive environments, there's always this potential for resistance.
Right. It might be subtle, it might be hidden, but it's always there.
Always there.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into asylums, what are some of the key takeaways that you hope our listeners will take away from it?
Well, I think the biggest one is that institutions, no matter how powerful they seem, are not these monolithic, unchanging entities.
Right. They're made up of people, and people are always capable of change.
Exactly. And because of that, institutions can change too. They can be challenged, they can be reformed.
We don't have to just accept them as they are.
Exactly. And I think that's a really empowering message, especially for people who might feel trapped or powerless within these systems.
Absolutely. So what can our listeners do? How can they take Goffman's insights and apply them to their own lives?
Well, first of all, just be aware. Pay attention to the institutions you encounter in your everyday life, whether it's your workplace, your school, your family.
Look for those power dynamics, those unspoken rules.
Right. And don't be afraid to ask questions.
Challenge the status quo.
Exactly. And support those who are already fighting for change, whether it's donating to an organization, volunteering your time, or just speaking out against injustice.
Every little bit helps.
It really does.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Erving Goffman's Asylums. We'll see you next time.